The year is 1959, and a man wakes on a wooden bench outside a facility he doesn't remember entering. His head throbs where metal has been fused to his skull. The city feels unfamiliar in ways he can't articulate, and when he reaches back through memory trying to understand how he arrived here, there's only fog and static and a distant voice assuring him he volunteered for something important. But that was before Season 1, Project Lupara, before Franco Barbie arrived with his shotgun and his appetites, and his conviction that violence is the only language worth speaking. What changed between the facility's opening and the moment a mafia reject became its newest instrument of terror is a story about how institutional evil doesn't just persist, it evolves. How a program designed to break ordinary people into sleeper agents discovered that sometimes the most effective weapons are the ones who were already broken when you found them. We're tracing the complete narrative of Season 1, from the documents that reveal Easterman's expanding ambitions to the arrival of Franco Barbie, and the docks where his particular brand of horror found its home. By the end, you'll understand how Murkoff's experiments escalated, why Barbie became essential to their work, and what it means when an organization realizes that gunning people down might be more efficient than the slow psychological destruction they'd been perfecting for years. Before we move forward, if something in this deep dive resonates with you, whether it's a specific detail about the facility's operations, a connection you made between Season 1 and the broader Outlast universe, or just a moment that made you understand the horror differently, drop a comment letting me know. And while you're down there, throw out a suggestion for the next video. Some of the best ideas come straight from you, and building this community means actually talking to each other in the comments section. So get comfortable, turn the lights down, and let's begin. The core truth you need to carry through this entire story is simple. Murkoff didn't just want to break people, they wanted to industrialize it. Chapter 1. The Refinement of Cruelty. To understand Season 1, you first need to understand what Signala had become by 1959. The facility wasn't new anymore. By 1959, the facility had been operational for approximately 4 years since Easterman arrived in August 1955 and began processing reagents through trials designed to destroy and reconstruct their sense of self. 4 years of refining techniques, documenting which forms of psychological pressure produced the most reliable compliance, learning which personalities could be programmed and which would resist until their minds simply collapsed inward. Project Lathe 2 had proven partially successful. Ordinary people could be transformed into something malleable through systematic trauma, sensory deprivation in the sleep room, pharmaceutical manipulation, exposure to prime assets whose charisma and violence created environments where survival required moral compromise. Reagents who entered Signala as postal workers or teachers or drifters left as something harder to define, if they left at all. Many didn't survive the trials. Others survived but emerged so fractured that deployment was impossible. They became ex-pops, failed experiments who wandered the facility's maintenance corridors, their minds destroyed but their bodies still functional enough to serve as obstacles in future trials. But enough reagents graduated, enough were successfully programmed that Murkoff could justify continued funding. And with that funding came pressure to expand, to process more subjects faster, to develop new trial environments that could break different psychological profiles. Easterman's broadcasts from this period reveal a man who'd grown comfortable with atrocity. His early recordings carried traces of hesitation, moments where you could hear him constructing justifications for what the facility did. By 59, those justifications had solidified into certainty. He spoke to reagents like a disappointed parent explaining necessary punishment. He framed their suffering as character development, and he genuinely seemed to believe that transforming human beings into programmable weapons was a service to American security and scientific progress. The prime assets had proven more valuable than Easterman initially expected. Leland Coyle's police station environment remained brutally effective. His presence transformed ordinary interrogation scenarios into theaters of terror, where reagents learned that authority figures could inflict unlimited pain without consequence. Coyle didn't just chase and punish, he taught. Every encounter with him reinforced that cooperation with power was survival, that resistance was futile, that the strong did what they wanted to the weak and called it order. Mother Gooseberry's orphanage served a different purpose. Where Coyle taught fear of authority, Gooseberry taught confusion about care. Her fractured personality cycled between maternal affection and explosive violence so rapidly that reagents couldn't predict which version they'd encounter. This unpredictability destroyed their ability to assess threats. They learned that even figures who presented as protective could turn lethal without warning, that trust itself was a vulnerability to be eliminated. Later commentary sometimes mentions an early beast figure alongside Coyle and Gooseberry, but the concrete prime assets the game itself foregrounds are those two, and, in Season 1, Franco Barbie. What's clear is that the beast represented pure predatory violence without the psychological complexity of Coyle or Gooseberry, something that chased not because of programming or delusion, but because hunting was its essential nature. Together, these three prime assets created a triangle of terror. Coyle was authority that crushed. Gooseberry was care that betrayed. The beast was violence that simply was. Reagents moving through trials encountered at least one of these figures, and each encounter carved away another piece of their resistance until what remained was compliant enough to program. But Easterman wanted more. He'd been corresponding with other Murkoff divisions, studying their approaches to behavioral modification. Mount Massive Asylum was developing the morphogenic engine, a device that induced lucid dreams while exposing subjects to hypnotic imagery, creating nanotech entities, and driving most test subjects into permanent psychosis. The results were fascinating but ultimately unusable. You couldn't deploy operatives who'd been driven insane. Signala's advantage was that it broke people without destroying their functionality. A properly processed reagent could return to civilian life, maintain employment, form relationships, appear completely normal until the activation phrase triggered their programming and they executed whatever orders had been embedded during their time in the facility. This was the goal that had eluded intelligence agencies for decades. Sleeper agents who didn't know they were sleeper agents. People who could live ordinary lives for years before suddenly becoming weapons, then returning to normalcy afterward with no conscious memory of what they'd done. Project Lathe 2 was producing these results, but slowly. The pharmaceutical regimen required months to fully take effect. The trial scenarios needed repeated exposure to properly condition responses, and some personalities simply resisted, requiring either additional processing that risked breaking them entirely or termination to prevent them from revealing the facility's operations. Murkoff's leadership began asking questions. Could the timeline be shortened? Could more subjects be processed simultaneously? And most critically, could the techniques be scaled up for potential military application? That last question revealed Murkoff's true ambitions. Signala wasn't just creating individual sleeper agents for espionage work. They were developing a system that could potentially process entire units of soldiers, transforming them into personnel who would follow any order without hesitation, moral consideration, or psychological breakdown. The implications were staggering. An army of individuals programmed to view civilian casualties as acceptable, torture as necessary procedure, atrocity as just another assignment. Soldiers who would commit war crimes without developing PTSD because their programming prevented them from recognizing those acts as crimes at all. Easterman threw himself into the challenge. He developed new pharmaceutical combinations that accelerated the breakdown of resistance. He designed additional trial environments, courtrooms where regents were forced to confess to crimes they hadn't committed, factories where they assembled weapons while being told they were building tools of peace, medical facilities where they administered harmful treatments to other reagents under the guise of healing. Each new environment targeted a different psychological structure. The trials weren't random torture, they were precisely calibrated attacks on specific cognitive functions, moral reasoning, empathy, the ability to trust your own memories and perceptions, the capacity to refuse orders that violated your values. Strip away enough of these functions, and what remained was an organism that looked human but operated more like a machine. Input command, receive execution, minimal resistance or questioning. But even as the techniques improved, Easterman recognized a fundamental limitation. The prime assets were effective at creating fear and forcing moral compromise, but they operated at close range. Coyle had to physically grab reagents. Gooseberry needed proximity to deploy her weapons. The beast required even closer contact. This meant reagents could sometimes escape through speed or hiding, could use the environment to create distance, could occasionally avoid encounters entirely through careful navigation. What Signala needed was a prime asset who could project threat across distance, someone who could make reagents feel unsafe, even when they thought they'd found cover, someone whose presence transformed every open space into a killing field. They needed someone with a gun. And in October of 1959, Murkoff's field operatives found exactly the right person in a brothel in Miami, covered in someone else's blood and laughing like a child. His name was Franco Barbie, and his arrival would mark the beginning of Project Lupara, Season 1's descent into a new caliber of institutional horror. Chapter 2: The Wolf Who Couldn't Grow Up. Franco Barbie was born wrong, though it would take years before anyone understood just how deep that wrongness went. He came into the world with a cranial birth defect, often described in files and commentary as resembling Crouzon syndrome or potentially Pfeiffer syndrome, conditions that distorted his facial structure and set him apart from other children. His eyes sat too far apart, his forehead protruded, his features carried the distinctive appearance of someone whose development had been interrupted by biology's cruelty. In another family, this might have elicited sympathy or extra care. In the Barbie crime family, it made him a joke before he could walk. His father, Salvatore Barbie, ran one of New Orleans' most profitable criminal operations. Salvatore dealt in everything: protection rackets, smuggling, gambling operations that stretched from Louisiana through Florida and into Cuba's casino scene. He was a man who commanded respect through violence and maintained power through the understanding that crossing him meant death for you and everyone you cared about. Salvatore had specific expectations for his sons. They would be strong, charismatic, capable of inspiring loyalty and fear in equal measure. They would represent the family's power through their presence alone. Franco, with his malformed face and his strange, childlike affect, represented the opposite. He was evidence that even powerful bloodlines could produce defects. Salvatore made his disappointment clear early. He mocked Franco's appearance in front of his men. He compared Franco unfavorably to his half-brothers from previous marriages. He made it understood that Franco's value to the family would need to come from usefulness rather than pride, because there was no pride to be found in a son who looked like a monster. Franco internalized this rejection in ways that would shape everything that followed. He became desperate for his father's approval, willing to do anything to prove he could be valuable despite his appearance. And in a crime family, value was measured in one currency: how willing you were to hurt people. Franco's first kill came when he was 10 years old, the age when he used his father's shotgun to murder a man who owed money to the family. A debtor owed his mafia father money. The man had been given extensions, then warnings, then a beating that should have clarified the situation, but he still hadn't paid, and Salvatore decided an example needed to be made. He gathered his men to handle the execution, and Franco was present, watching from the periphery as he always was, tolerated but never included. Salvatore's shotgun leaned against the wall. A Lupara, the traditional sawed-off shotgun favored by Italian organized crime. The barrel had been cut down for close-quarters work, making it devastating at short range but nearly impossible to control due to extreme recoil. Franco picked up the weapon. He walked toward the debtor, who was on his knees begging for more time. And before anyone could stop him, Franco fired. The recoil was catastrophic. The shotgun kicked back with such force that it shattered Franco's already fragile facial bones. His cheekbones cracked, his eye sockets fractured, his teeth broke and cut into his gums. The pain must have been extraordinary, the kind of trauma that would send most adults into shock. Franco started laughing. The debtor was dead. Franco's face was ruined further, blood pouring from his nose and mouth, and he was laughing like it was the funniest thing that had ever happened. His father's men stood frozen, unsure how to process what they'd just witnessed. Salvatore himself reportedly went silent, recognizing that something in his son was fundamentally different from normal human psychology. This should have been the moment where Franco received help. Psychiatric intervention, evaluation by doctors who might have identified early-stage personality disorders that could be managed with proper treatment. Instead, Salvatore saw potential. His deformed son might be useful after all, as a weapon that felt no hesitation and feared no consequence. Franco became the family's enforcer. Other men did the sophisticated work, negotiating deals, managing operations, building relationships with other criminal organizations. Franco handled the wet work, collections that required violence, punishments that needed to be memorable, eliminations that sent messages. He was effective because he enjoyed it. Where professional hitmen treated killing as unpleasant business, Franco treated it as play. He laughed during murders. He drew them out, experimenting with different methods, fascinated by the sounds people made and the ways their bodies reacted to trauma. His weapon of choice remained the Lupara shotgun, and he named each one Lupara, refusing to distinguish between individual weapons because to him they were all extensions of the same instrument, his means of making his father notice him. But Salvatore never gave Franco the approval he craved. The violence was expected, not celebrated. Franco was useful, not beloved. He remained the deformed son who happened to be effective at killing, tolerated for his utility but never embraced as a true member of the family's inner circle. This rejection twisted Franco further. He developed increasingly disturbing behaviors. He began killing sex workers, drawn to them because they represented the only intimacy available to someone with his appearance, but also because he could afford to purchase access to them. The murders grew more elaborate. He didn't just kill, he mutilated. He experimented with bodies. Stories about his crimes describe bodies mutilated past recognition, a pattern of overkill that suggested he was seeking something through violence he could never actually reach. Child psychologists have terms for this kind of behavior: regression triggered by severe attachment disorder and trauma. Franco's crawling into corpses suggests he was trying to return to the womb, to a state before his birth defects made him a disappointment, before the world rejected him. But Franco had no access to psychologists or treatment. He had only his Lupara, his father's indifference, and an escalating compulsion to do things that would finally make someone acknowledge him. The murders eventually drew too much attention. Police started investigating. Federal authorities began connecting deaths across state lines. The Barbie family's operations were attracting scrutiny they couldn't afford, and Salvatore knew The cause was his deformed son's inability to kill discreetly. There are conflicting accounts about why Franco was sent to Miami. Some documents suggest Salvatore sent him to assist with Cuban casino operations, keeping the family's ties to counter-revolutionary movements functional. Other sources indicate it was simply exile. Get Franco out of New Orleans before his pattern of murders brought down the entire organization. The truth appears to be darker. Franco had developed an obsession with his stepmother, Salvatore's fourth wife. The nature of that obsession isn't fully documented, but it was severe enough that Salvatore made it clear Franco was no longer welcome in New Orleans. This was presented as kindness. Most men in Franco's position would have been killed for the disrespect. Franco was allowed to live as long as he stayed away. Miami became Franco's new territory. He had money from family operations, he had his Lupara, and he had no supervision, no structure, nothing to prevent him from indulging every impulse that 4 years of controlled violence for his father's benefit had forced him to restrain. He descended fully into his pathologies. The sex workers in Miami's underworld learned to fear him. No amount of money was worth the danger of being alone with Franco Barbie. He hurt them in ways that went beyond sadism into territory that suggested his mind had long since departed from anything resembling normal human psychology. The brothel workers started calling him Il Bambino, the baby, partly because of his childlike affect, his tantrums, and his laughter, partly because of his regression, his need to curl up in small spaces, his obsession with themes of birth and motherhood, and partly because he was dangerous in the way small children are dangerous, without understanding consequences, without empathy, acting purely on impulse and need. By the late 1950s, Franco Barbie had already earned a reputation in Miami for murdering sex workers and other victims in sadistic displays that drew police attention and underworld fear. His methods had become so distinctive that police connected the cases immediately. But the Barbie family's influence extended even to Miami, and witnesses had a way of forgetting what they'd seen, or disappearing before they could testify. That is when Clyde Perry received his assignment spelled out in files like AKA Il Bambino and Get Barbie, locate Franco Barbie in Miami, assess his potential as a Murkoff asset, and secure him for transfer to the program. Murkoff's criteria for prime asset candidates had evolved. They weren't looking for people who could be broken and rebuilt. They were looking for people who were already broken in ways that made them effective at breaking others. Coyle was a sadistic veteran with PTSD. Gooseberry was a fractured personality with maternal delusions. The Beast was something even darker. Franco Barbie fit the profile perfectly. His violence was enthusiastic rather than reluctant. His appearance created immediate psychological pressure. Reagents encountering him would be dealing with someone who looked monstrous even before he started shooting. And most importantly, he operated at range with his Lupara, solving the problem of prime assets, who could only threaten at close quarters. If Signala could harness Franco, they'd have a prime asset who could control entire environments through the threat of being shot at any moment. Reagents wouldn't be able to run or hide with the same effectiveness. Because Franco didn't need to chase, he could kill from across large spaces, turning the facility's open areas into hunting grounds where movement itself became risk. Perry tracked Franco through Miami's underworld. Following a trail of terrified sex workers and bodies, the search led him to a brothel called the Gator Hook, where Franco had been seen regularly. Perry arrived late at night, staked out the location, and at 3:44 in the morning heard screaming from inside. He found Franco in the aftermath of yet another slaughter. A working girl, dead and mutilated, the room a testament to Franco's habitual excess and contempt for human life. And Franco had crawled inside the corpse, using it like a sleeping bag, his upper body emerging from the dead woman's torso like a demented birth. He saw Perry. He smiled. And he said his first recorded words that would become part of his file. "Nobody touches my product. It's mine." Then Franco attacked with a broken bottle, smacking Clyde's gun from his hand before hitting him with the bottle against his skull, then grabbing Lupera and shooting Perry in the thigh, only for a bystander's sudden arrival to give Perry the opening he needed to escape. Most field operatives would have called for termination at that point. Franco was too dangerous, too unstable, too likely to turn on handlers. But Perry recognized something in Franco's behavior, the childlike need for approval, the desperate attachment to his weapon, the way he'd demanded Perry not touch his Lupara before trying to kill him. Franco Barbie could be controlled, Perry reported back to Signala. His need for paternal approval created a vulnerability that Murkoff could exploit. Tell him his father would finally be proud. Frame his violence as service rather than sickness. Give him an environment where shooting people was the job rather than the crime. And Franco would become the most effective prime asset the program had ever deployed. Easterman read Perry's report with growing excitement. This was exactly what Project Lathe 2 needed. Not rehabilitation of Franco Barbie. His pathologies were perfect as they were. Just direction. Point him at reagents instead of sex workers. Let him hunt inside controlled environments. And watch how quickly reagents learned that open spaces offered no safety when a man with a shotgun could end them from 30 feet away. In late 1959, Franco Barbie was transported to Signala. He was told his father had arranged for him to do important work, that this was his chance to prove he was valuable to the family, that he'd be compensated and appreciated. It's unclear whether Franco believed these lies or simply didn't care because he was being given permission to shoot people. What's clear is that Franco arrived at the facility with his Lupara and his pathologies and his desperate need to finally be acknowledged as something other than a disappointment. Murkoff was about to give him exactly what he wanted, and in doing so, they'd transform Season 1 from a program of psychological manipulation into something faster, louder, and infinitely more violent. Chapter 3. Project Lupara begins. Franco's integration into Signala required preparation. The facility hadn't needed for previous prime assets. Coyle had been a police officer and military veteran, someone already trained to operate within institutional structures. He understood orders, hierarchies, the concept of controlled violence for specific objectives. Gooseberry was psychotic but responsive to framing that aligned with her maternal delusions. Tell her she was protecting children from contamination, and she'd accept that narrative, functioning within it even while her fractured personalities cycled through their various states. Franco was neither structured nor delusional in ways that made him easy to direct. He was impulsive, childlike, motivated primarily by need for approval and opportunity to hurt people. You couldn't give him complex instructions because his attention span was fractured. You couldn't trust him to follow protocols because he'd never developed the executive function that allowed for delayed gratification or strategic thinking. What you could do was create an environment where his impulses aligned with program objectives. Then praise him when he did what came naturally. Easterman designed an orientation program specifically for Franco. It involved hours in the sleep room, but instead of the pharmaceutical manipulation used on reagents, Franco's exposure was to recorded messages that presented Salvatore Barbie's voice, or a convincing facsimile, praising Franco's violence and telling him that this work at Signala would finally make the family proud. Whether Franco believed these recordings were genuine or simply wanted to believe them badly enough that questions didn't matter, he responded. His behavior in the facility became marginally more controlled. He'd wait for trial scenarios to begin before he started shooting. He'd return to designated holding areas between sessions. And most importantly, he accepted that Reagents were his targets and facility staff were not to be touched. Early in his orientation, Franco attacked a guard who reminded him of one of his half-brothers. The response was immediate and calculated. Franco was sedated, restrained, and when he woke, he found a recording waiting. Salvatore's voice explaining that shooting Murkoff's staff would disappoint him deeply, that Franco needed to control himself and focus on the real targets, that the family was counting on him to prove he wasn't just a deformed child who couldn't follow simple instructions. Franco never attacked facility staff again. The threat of disappointing the father figure he'd spent his entire life trying to please was more effective than any physical punishment could have been. With Franco's behavior calibrated, the facility began construction on a new trial environment designed specifically to showcase his capabilities. The location chosen was a waterfront dock complex, a sprawling space with warehouses, shipping containers, open loading areas, and the kind of vertical and horizontal space that made traditional prime asset chase sequences difficult but would allow Franco to demonstrate the effectiveness of ranged threat. The dock's design was brilliant in its attention to psychological detail. It felt real in ways previous trial environments hadn't quite achieved. The police station felt like a warped slice of Law and Order America, the orphanage like a twisted sanctuary full of mannequins and broken comforts, each space real enough to sell the illusion, while wrong enough to keep reagents off balance. The docks felt functional, like they could genuinely be used for shipping operations, which made the horror of what happened there more visceral. Reagents entering the dock environment would understand immediately that cover was limited and sight lines were long. They'd see open spaces between containers where Franco could spot them from elevated positions. They'd hear the distinctive sound of his Luparaz modification, the click of shells being loaded, the mechanical slide that preceded firing, and they'd learn that running in open space was suicide because Franco didn't need to chase. He just needed a clear shot. The flagship trial for this environment has reagents poisoning a drug shipment. Mechanically, they move through the docks, finding chemicals and dosing crates of product destined for distribution, all while Easterman frames it as regulating pain and death. The drugs were ostensibly heading to enemy nations as part of Cold War sabotage operations. Poisoning them was presented as patriotic duty, protecting American interests by ensuring enemy populations received contaminated medicine. The reality was more disturbing. The fiction within the program hints that these drugs are bound for vulnerable communities and black market networks alike, leaving it deliberately unclear whether reagents are crippling enemies, civilians, or both. Contaminating these shipments would sicken or kill civilians who had nothing to do with international conflict. The trial forced reagents to commit what amounted to bioterrorism against innocent populations, while believing they were serving their country. This created moral injury distinct from the direct violence of other trials. In Snitches Get Stitches, you killed someone face to face. There was guilt, but there was also immediacy, threat, and response. In Poison the Medicine, you were causing deaths you'd never witness, poisoning people whose faces you'd never see, participating in systemic violence that felt almost administrative in its remove. Easterman hypothesized that this would break different psychological structures than direct violence. Some reagents could rationalize killing another person in self-defense or under pressure. Fewer could rationalize poisoning medication shipments while maintaining coherent moral self-concept. The trial targeted the part of consciousness that needed to believe you were fundamentally good, that your actions aligned with your values, that you could live with what you'd done. Franco's role in this trial was elegantly simple. Hunt. He was given no complex instructions beyond patrol the dock environment, identify reagents attempting to complete objectives, and shoot them. He didn't need to understand why they were poisoning medicine. He didn't need context about Cold War operations. He just needed targets, and Murkoff provided those in abundance. The first trial runs of Poison the Medicine revealed immediately how transformative Franco was as a prime asset. Previous trials had rhythm. You'd move through an environment, hear coils chains or gooseberries singing, know an encounter was approaching, and either find hiding spots or navigate around the threat. There was tension, certainly, but there was also pattern. Learn the prime asset's behavior, and you could predict and avoid. Franco destroyed pattern. His movement through the docks was erratic because his attention span was fractured. He'd patrol one section obsessively, then suddenly abandon it to investigate something that caught his eye across the entire environment. He'd laugh during chases, not the measured intimidation of Coil, but genuine childlike amusement, making it impossible to gauge his proximity or intention through audio cues alone. And the Lupara changed everything about threat assessment. Previous prime assets could be evaded through sprint and clever navigation. Franco could down Reagents from distances that made running feel futile. You'd be crossing an open space, hear the shotguns report, and find yourself bleeding out before you'd understood he'd spotted you. The psychological impact was immediate. Reagents who'd survived previous trials through learned tactics found those tactics useless. The stress responses that had helped them navigate Coil's aggression or Gooseberry's unpredictability didn't translate. Franco operated by different rules, and those rules made the docks feel like something new. Not just more difficult, but fundamentally different in ways that prevented adaptation. Completion rates for Poison the Medicine dropped dramatically compared to earlier trials. More reagents failed objectives, got killed during attempts, experienced breakdowns that forced early termination. But those who did complete the trial emerged changed in ways that fascinated Easterman. They'd learned to operate under constant threat of death from range. They'd internalized that open spaces were deadly. That movement required calculation, that survival depended on accepting vulnerability as constant state. These lessons would be invaluable for operatives deployed in hostile territory, where threats could emerge from anywhere at any moment. And they'd committed an act of bioterrorism while being praised for patriotic service. Their moral framework had been compromised in ways that made future compromises easier. If you could poison medication shipments, what couldn't you do when properly authorized? Franco thrived in his new role. He received regular recordings from Salvatore praising his performance. He was given new Lupara shotguns when his weapons required maintenance. He was allowed to modify his weapons, decorating them with wolf imagery that connected to his other fixation, the mythological Romulus and Remus, abandoned children raised by a wolf mother, founder myths that Franco had latched onto as explanation for his own abandonment by adequate parenting. He began calling himself the Wolf. His weapons were Lupara, named for the wolf. He drank a cocktail called Wolf's Milk before trials, a mixture of alcohol and substances that heightened his already erratic behavior. The wolf mythology gave Franco a narrative for his existence that felt better than deformed disappointment or family embarrassment. He was the wolf child, raised in blood, destined to hunt. Murkoff encouraged these delusions because they kept Franco functional. Let him believe whatever he needed to believe as long as he kept hunting reagents effectively. His psychological condition was irrelevant except where it impacted performance, and his condition enhanced his performance by making him genuinely frightening in ways that calculated sadism couldn't match. Season 1 was officially christened Project Lupara in honor of Franco's weapon and the transformation he represented. The project's goals expanded beyond simple reagent processing. Easterman began documenting how range threat altered behavioral conditioning, whether reagents who survived Franco's hunting developed useful traits for field operations, if the trauma of being shot at repeatedly created psychological profiles, distinct from the close-quarters terror of previous prime assets. The data suggested interesting possibilities. Reagents who survived the docks demonstrated heightened situational awareness faster. threat response times, and improved ability to function under sustained pressure. They also showed increased paranoia, difficulty trusting their environment, and hypervigilance that bordered on exhausting. But these were features, not bugs, for personnel who might be deployed in genuinely dangerous situations. Murkoff's military liaisons began requesting demonstrations. If Signala could produce operatives who function effectively under ranged threat, perhaps the techniques could be adapted for combat training. Traditional soldiers received weapons training and tactical instruction, but they didn't receive psychological conditioning that prevented them from freezing under fire or breaking down after sustained combat exposure. What if you could create soldiers who'd been pre-traumatized in controlled environments, who'd already experienced the worst stress of combat, and learned to function through it, who would see actual warfare as less frightening than their training because, at least in warfare, the enemy wasn't Franco Barbie with his Lupara and his laughter? This was the horrifying logic of Project Lupara. Take the worst elements of psychological torture, reframe them as advanced training, and produce personnel who viewed atrocity as normal operating procedure. Easterman was developing exactly what the military-industrial complex had wanted since the Korean War revealed that standard soldiers could be broken through psychological pressure. Create soldiers who couldn't be broken because you'd already broken them in ways that made them stronger rather than shattered. Franco Barbie, the mafia reject who crawled into corpses seeking a mother's embrace, had become essential to advancing American military capability. His pathology was being weaponized, not just against individual reagents, but potentially against entire geopolitical conflicts. The facility's Season 1 documentation reveals Easterman's growing confidence. He wrote memos proposing expansion of Project Lupara, more prime assets with ranged capabilities, additional environments that forced reagents to operate under sustained fire, pharmaceutical modifications that would heighten stress response during training, then suppress it during deployment. He even drafted internal suggestions about eventually testing conditioned reagents in real-world operations, letting their performance be measured against traditionally trained personnel. If reagents outperformed conventional operatives, it would prove the program's value and justify the extraordinary measures used to produce them. Murkoff's executive leadership was interested. The financial investment in Signala had been substantial, and they needed returns beyond raw data. Deployable assets would prove the program's practical worth, and if those assets were effective enough, Murkoff could position itself as the premier provider of advanced personnel training for military and intelligence services, turning psychological torture into a billion-dollar industry. But there were complications. Some reagents were escaping, not in large numbers, but enough to create risk. They'd survive trials, get processed through additional conditioning, then disappear during transport or deployment preparation. Most were recovered. Murkoff's security apparatus was extensive, and former reagents were easy to track through the monitoring systems embedded during their time at Signala. But a few stayed missing, and missing reagents represented catastrophic security breaches. They carried knowledge of the facility, memories of the trials, programming that might be examined by hostile intelligence services. They were walking evidence of everything Murkoff had done, and they were out in the world uncontrolled. The organization began discussing whether Project Lupara needed additional security measures, tracking implants, deeper programming that would trigger self-destructive responses if reagents tried to disclose facility operations, termination protocols that could be activated remotely if a reagent went rogue. These discussions revealed the progression from experimental program to institutional machine. The early days of Project Lathe had involved exploration. What's possible? What works? What breaks people effectively? Season 1 represented industrialization. Scale up what works. Eliminate inefficiencies. Prepare for broader deployment. The human cost was abstracted into metrics. reagent mortality rates, programming success percentages, cost per functional operative. The suffering that produced these numbers, minds destroyed, lives erased, people transformed into weapons against their will, became background noise, acceptable losses in pursuit of objectives that served national security and corporate profit. And presiding over the dock environment where much of this was proven was Franco Barbie, a man so damaged by childhood trauma and biological accident that he'd become perfect for a system that required enthusiastic violence from personnel who'd never question whether their orders were legitimate. He hunted Reagents through shipping containers. He laughed when his Lupara tore through their cover. He returned to his holding area each night and listened to recordings of a father who wasn't really speaking to him, who would never actually be proud of him, who had sent him away because his existence was embarrassment. But Franco didn't know that. He believed he was finally earning approval, that the family would welcome him back, that being the wolf meant he was something other than a disappointment. Murkoff let him believe it because belief kept him functional. And functional was all that mattered when you were building an empire on suffering and calling it science. Chapter 4. The Machinery of Compliance. By late 1959, the docks had become Signala's most effective training ground, and the data Easterman collected revealed patterns that changed how Murkoff understood psychological conditioning. Traditional interrogation and brainwashing techniques relied on isolation and repetition, lock someone in sensory deprivation until their mind became malleable, then introduce new beliefs through constant reinforcement. The process worked but required months per subject and produced unreliable results. Some people broke completely, becoming non-functional. Others appeared compliant but retained enough internal resistance that their programming could fail when tested. The docs solved both problems through a mechanism Easterman called environmental pressure integration. Instead of breaking people through isolation, break them through action. Force them to complete objectives while under extreme threat. Make them commit moral violations while telling them it's necessary. Praise them for compliance and punish resistance so consistently that choosing cooperation becomes automatic. The brilliance was in the pacing. Reagents weren't given time to reflect on what they were doing. The trials moved quickly. Enter environment, receive objectives, execute under pressure from Franco's hunting, complete and extract, return to sleep room for brief rest, then begin again. The speed prevented processing. You couldn't sit with the guilt of poisoning medicine shipments when you were immediately cycled into the next trial scenario, and the variety prevented adaptation through repetition. Every trial environment offered different challenges. The police station taught compliance with authority. The orphanage taught confusion about care and threat. The courtroom taught that truth was negotiable. The factory taught that your labor could harm even when you were told it helped. The docks taught that open spaces meant death, and only completing objectives quickly would save you. Reagents moving through this rotation experienced constant psychological pressure from different angles. They couldn't develop stable resistance because every trial attacked different cognitive structures. By the time you'd mentally processed the trauma of betraying another reagent in the police station, you were already halfway through the orphanage dealing with Gooseberry's maternal violence, and before you'd integrated that experience, you were in the docks being hunted by Franco. The programming didn't need to be deliberate or obvious. It emerged from accumulated experience. After enough trials where completing objectives meant survival and hesitation meant death, you stopped hesitating. After enough scenarios where you were praised for doing terrible things and punished for moral resistance, your moral framework weakened. After enough cycles through the sleep room where Easterman's voice assured you that everything you'd done was necessary and valuable, you started believing him because the alternative, accepting that you'd been tortured into committing atrocities, was psychologically unbearable. This created a form of Stockholm syndrome at institutional scale. Reagents began identifying with their captors, adopting Murkoff's framing, viewing their experiences as training rather than trauma. Some even expressed gratitude. They'd been weak before Signala, they told themselves. The trials made them strong. The suffering had purpose. Easterman documented these transformations with clinical satisfaction. His notes from late 59 described reagents who'd entered the facility as postal workers or mechanics emerging as what he called psychologically hardened assets, individuals capable of functioning in extreme environments without moral constraints or emotional breakdown. Imagine a case study like the ones Murkoff would have loved to circulate internally. A reagent who arrives at Signala as an ordinary civilian, conflict averse, recruited through promises of government work and benefits. After months of trials, Coyle Station, Gooseberry's orphanage, the docks with Franco, he stops showing distress when given orders to harm others. His hesitation shrinks, his completion rate climbs, and when interviewed, he talks about being useful instead of being a weak civilian. That's the goal. Transform reluctance into eagerness. Turn moral consideration into liability to be eliminated. Create personnel who follow orders immediately, regardless of the order's ethical dimensions. And the most disturbing detail isn't the obedience, it's what obedience costs. The longer you survive the trials, the more empathy stops behaving like empathy. People become objectives, faces become data. The parts of you that used to flinch go quiet. This file circulated among Murkoff's executive leadership and their military liaisons. The response was enthusiastic. 734 represented proof of concept. An ordinary person with no military background or violent history, transformed into an operative who could be deployed anywhere, maintain cover indefinitely, and execute orders without moral interference. The military implications were staggering. Imagine units composed entirely of personnel who'd been through Signala's processing, soldiers who would commit war crimes without developing PTSD, intelligence operatives who could torture without hesitation or subsequent breakdown, personnel who would follow any order because their ability to question orders had been systematically destroyed, and because they'd been processed as civilians rather than recruited from military populations, they had no paper trail connecting them to defense departments or intelligence agencies. They were ghosts, ordinary people who could be activated, used, then returned to normal life with no one aware they'd been operational. Murkoff began preparing proposals for expanded operations, new facilities beyond Signala, streamlined processing that could handle larger reagent populations, partnerships with foreign governments interested in developing similar capabilities. The company was positioning itself to become the dominant provider of psychological conditioning services to military and intelligence communities worldwide. Season 1's success, particularly Franco's effectiveness at the docks, had proven the viability of ranged threat as conditioning tool. Murkoff's research division began exploring other prime asset possibilities. What about snipers who could threaten from even greater distances? What about environmental hazards that forced reagents to navigate spaces where any moment might bring death from sources they couldn't predict or avoid? The goal was comprehensive psychological destruction, followed by controlled reconstruction. Break every defense mechanism, every moral framework, every psychological structure that made someone an autonomous individual with values and boundaries. Then rebuild them as functional automatons who looked and acted human but operated like machines. Input command, receive execution, minimal resistance. This was institutional horror at its most sophisticated. The torturers wore lab coats and called themselves behavioral scientists. The torture was reframed as advanced training. The victims were told They were volunteers becoming valuable assets, and the entire apparatus was funded through classified budgets and corporate investment, insulated from oversight or accountability. Franco's role in this machinery was straightforward. He was the predator that taught prey to move faster. He was the random death that taught constant vigilance. He was the laughing nightmare that taught you couldn't rely on enemies behaving rationally or predictably. But Franco himself remained largely unaware of the larger implications. He understood only that he had targets, that shooting them pleased the authority figures whose approval he craved, and that this was better than Miami, where people looked at him with disgust, and his father ignored his existence. The facility gave him purpose. The recordings gave him validation. The trials gave him permission to be exactly who his damage had made him, and he embraced it completely, never questioning whether the reagents he hunted were actually volunteers or enemy combatants, never wondering why they screamed and begged if they'd supposedly agreed to this training. Questions like that required a moral framework Franco had never developed. His childhood abuse and genetic condition had created someone capable of violence without empathy, and Murkoff had found the perfect application for that capability. Chapter 5: Cracks in the Foundation. But no system is perfect, and by early 1960, cracks were appearing in Project Lupara's foundation. The first problem was Franco himself. His effectiveness as prime asset was undeniable, but his behavior was becoming increasingly erratic. He'd always been unstable. That was why Murkoff wanted him. But stability and controllability existed on a spectrum, and Franco was sliding toward a level of chaos that threatened facility operations. He began personalizing kills. Previous prime assets maintained some professional distance. Coyle was sadistic but consistent. Gooseberry was unpredictable, but her violence followed patterns tied to her delusions. Franco started developing attachments to specific reagents, hunting them obsessively across multiple trials, keeping trophies from kills, drawing wolf imagery in their blood. This wasn't protocol. Prime assets were supposed to threaten and occasionally eliminate reagents who failed. Objectives, but the goal was conditioning, not systematic slaughter. Franco was killing reagents at rates that interfered with their progression through trial sequences. You couldn't program someone who was dead. Facility staff tried various interventions. They played recordings emphasizing that Franco needed to let reagents complete trials, rather than killing them immediately. They adjusted his wolf's milk cocktail to reduce aggression. They threatened withdrawal of privileges. Nothing worked consistently. Franco would comply for a few trials, then revert to excessive violence. His need for approval made him want to follow instructions, but his impulse control was so compromised that wanting to comply didn't translate to actually complying when he saw a target. The second problem was reagent resistance. A small percentage of subjects were proving resistant to conditioning, regardless of how many trials they completed or how much pharmaceutical manipulation they received. These resistant reagents maintained moral frameworks that prevented full programming. They'd complete trials because refusing meant death, but they didn't internalize the justifications. They recognized they were being tortured rather than trained. Some of these resistant reagents began communicating with each other, developing signals and brief exchanges during trials when prime assets weren't immediately present. They couldn't organize escape attempts. Security was too comprehensive, but they could share information, confirm that others recognized the situation's reality, provide the psychological support that comes from knowing you're not alone in seeing through institutional lies. Murkoff detected this resistance through monitoring systems. Hidden cameras and microphones recorded every interaction. The facility's response was immediate. Resistant reagents were segregated, subjected to enhanced conditioning protocols that involved extended sleep room exposure and increased pharmaceutical dosing. Many broke under this enhanced pressure, but a few didn't. Their psychological structures were resilient enough that even extreme measures couldn't fully compromise their sense of self. These reagents presented a unique problem. They couldn't be deployed because their programming was incomplete. They couldn't be released because they carried too much knowledge about facility operations, and they couldn't remain at Signala indefinitely, consuming resources. The solution was disturbing in its efficiency. Resistant reagents were redesignated as X-POPs. They were dosed with compounds that induced permanent psychotic states, destroying their minds while leaving their bodies functional. Then they were released back into trial environments as obstacles, mindless attackers that threatened other reagents while serving as object lessons about what happened to people who resisted too effectively. This redesignation solved multiple problems. It eliminated security risks from resistant reagents. It provided additional threats for trial scenarios, and it demonstrated to compliant reagents that resistance had consequences worse than cooperation. But it also revealed the program's fundamental cruelty. Murkoff wasn't just willing to torture people into compliance. They were willing to destroy people who couldn't be tortured into compliance, turning them into weapons against others experiencing the same trauma they'd endured. The third problem was external scrutiny. Families of missing people were asking questions. Some of the reagents recruited through classified ads or criminal justice diversions had relatives who'd hired private investigators or contacted media outlets. Most of these inquiries were dead-ended through Murkoff's security apparatus. Evidence disappeared, investigators received warnings, journalists found their sources suddenly unwilling to talk, but enough noise accumulated that certain members of Congress began receiving constituent complaints about disappearances linked to government programs. And while Murkoff had considerable influence in Washington, they couldn't completely control investigation by legislators with security clearances and oversight authority. The company deployed legal and public relations teams to manage the situation. Their strategy was to acknowledge limited truth while denying the full scope. Yes, there were classified research programs exploring psychological resilience training. Yes, some volunteers experienced adverse effects and were being treated. No, there was no torture or illegal experimentation. No, the conspiracy theories circulating were exaggerations from anti-government activists. This strategy was partially effective. It created enough ambiguity that serious investigation stalled. But it also put Murkoff on notice that Project Lupara couldn't continue indefinitely at current scale without eventually triggering oversight that even classified program status couldn't shield against. Easterman's response to these problems was characteristic. Double down, expand operations, process reagents faster before external pressure forced shutdown. His memos from early '60 reveal a man aware that time was limited, determined to prove his program's value before circumstances made continuation impossible. He proposed accelerated trial sequences that would process reagents through all environments in 3 months instead of 6. He suggested pharmaceutical modifications that would speed psychological breakdown. He even drafted plans for mobile facilities that could operate temporarily in different locations, making them harder to investigate than a permanent installation like Signala. Some of these proposals were approved. Others were rejected as too risky, but the overall trajectory was clear. Project Lupara was approaching a crisis point where it would either need to demonstrate sufficient value to justify continued protection from oversight, or it would be shut down to prevent scandal. This created immense pressure on facility operations. Trial schedules intensified. Reagents were processed with less recovery time between sessions. Prime assets, including Franco, were pushed to work longer hours, conduct more hunts, create more pressure. The human cost accelerated proportionally. More reagents broke completely, requiring conversion to X-POPs. More experienced adverse pharmaceutical reactions that left them permanently damaged. More died during trials, not from prime asset violence, but from physical and psychological collapse under sustained pressure. Signala's original morgue, designed to handle occasional subject deaths, became inadequate. A secondary morgue was constructed, then a third. Bodies accumulated faster than they could be disposed of through Murkoff's covert channels. These deaths created their own security risk. Missing people could be explained away for months or even years, but bodies required burial or cremation, and those processes created records. Murkoff's solution was to transport remains to remote locations, desert burial sites, incineration facilities with cooperative management, locations where evidence could be buried literally and figuratively. The logistics became complex enough that Murkoff assigned dedicated personnel to what internal memos called asset disposal. This bureaucratic language masked the reality. They'd created job positions whose entire function was hiding evidence of people the company had tortured to death. And through all of this, Franco continued hunting. The docks remained operational. The docks trial, with its poison the drugs objective and long sightlines, kept cycling regents who survived long enough to earn this therapy. Franco's Lupera continued firing. His laughter continued echoing through shipping containers. He was told everything was fine, that the program was succeeding, that his father would be proud, and he believed it because believing gave his existence meaning that reality never had. But people who worked directly with Franco began noticing disturbing progressions. He talked to his weapons more frequently, full conversations with Lupara, as though the shotgun responded. He drew increasingly elaborate wolf imagery in his holding area, covering walls with childlike drawings that revealed someone whose mind was fragmenting further despite, or perhaps because of, the sustained violence he committed daily. There were incidents where Franco needed sedation because he became fixated on something and couldn't be redirected through normal means. Times when he'd attack his own reflection, convinced the person in the mirror was a threat. Moments where he'd curl into fetal position and refuse to move, regressing to infancy while clutching his shotgun. Murkoff's psychiatric consultants warned that Franco was destabilizing. His usefulness might have a limited lifespan. They recommended preparing contingencies, backup prime assets, and with ranged capabilities, alternative trial designs that didn't depend on his specific presence. But Easterman resisted these recommendations. Franco was working. The docs were producing exceptional conditioning results. Why fix what wasn't broken, even if the instrument was cracking? This decision reveals something crucial about institutional thinking. When a system is producing desired outcomes, the people running that system become invested in maintaining it, regardless of warning signs. Franco was effective, therefore Franco should continue operating. The fact that his effectiveness came from pathologies that were worsening was treated as someone else's problem to manage later. Later arrived sooner than expected. Chapter 6. The Incident. Sometime in 1960, a trial run of Poison the Medicine went wrong. Standard protocol. The reagents enter the dock environment, receive objectives through Easterman's broadcast, and begin attempting to contaminate the medicine. Shipments while Franco patrols and applies pressure. Except Franco wasn't patrolling normally. Staff monitoring the trial noticed immediately that his behavior was off. He was moving erratically even by his standards, talking constantly to Lupara, laughing at nothing visible. The wolf's milk cocktail he'd consumed before. The trial had been mixed incorrectly. Someone in the pharmaceutical division had doubled the amphetamine component. Franco was experiencing something approaching psychotic break, amplified by stimulants. And he was armed with a shotgun in an enclosed space with 4 reagents, who had no idea their predator had just become significantly more dangerous. The first kill was expected. One reagent moved across open space without checking sightlines. Franco spotted him from an elevated position and fired. The reagent went down. This was protocol, punishment for careless movement. Demonstration that the environment demanded respect. The second kill raised concerns. Franco descended from his position, approached the wounded reagent who was still alive and fired 3 more times at close range. This was excessive. The reagent was already eliminated as threat. Additional violence served no conditioning purpose. The control room staff began discussing whether to trigger emergency extraction, but before they could implement that decision, Franco turned his attention to a second reagent who'd been hiding in a shipping container. He didn't shoot immediately. Instead, he began speaking to the reagent in Italian, words that monitoring staff couldn't fully understand, but which seemed to involve his family, his father, his stepmother. He was confusing the reagent with someone from his past, playing out some internal drama that had nothing to do with the trial's objectives. Then he shot the container repeatedly, perforating the metal with enough force that the reagent inside was wounded by shrapnel and ricochets. Franco reloaded, opened the container, fired again. The third and fourth reagents witnessed this and broke protocol. They ran for the emergency exit, the sealed door that staff could open remotely for trial termination. They were screaming for help, pounding on the door, begging to be extracted. Franco heard them, turned, and his face carried an expression that monitoring staff would later describe as purely predatory. Not human anger or sadism, but something animal recognizing prey. He advanced on them. They couldn't escape. The door required facility override to open. And Franco took his time, savoring their fear, speaking to them in the mixture of Italian and English that suggested his mind had departed from any connection to present reality. He killed them both, not quickly, not for conditioning purposes, slowly, deliberately, in ways that served only his own fractured psychological needs. The trial was terminated. Emergency response teams entered the dock, sedated Franco, and extracted his unconscious body. The Force, Reagents were dead. Months of processing and significant resource investment, eliminated in 15 minutes because a prime asset had experienced catastrophic behavioral failure. Easterman was furious, not because of the dead reagents, they were replaceable, not because of Franco's behavior, that was always a risk, but because the incident proved his critics right. Franco was too unstable for sustained use. The program needed redundancy and fail-safes that should have been implemented months earlier. An internal review was conducted. The findings were damning. The pharmaceutical error that produced Franco's reaction was the immediate cause. But the larger issue was that facility protocols treated Franco as equipment rather than as an unstable person with worsening psychiatric condition. There were no monitoring systems tracking his psychological state, no interventions planned for when he inevitably deteriorated further, no backup plans for trials that depended on his presence. The review recommended Franco's removal from active operations and replacement with alternative prime assets. It suggested the dock environment be mothballed until safer threat mechanisms could be developed. It advised that Project Lupara's accelerated timeline was creating unacceptable risks. Murkoff's leadership faced a decision: accept these recommendations and slow operations, or reject them and continue at current pace hoping Franco could be stabilized. They chose continuation. The military liaisons were too interested, the potential contracts too valuable, the possibility of shutting down too politically dangerous, given how much had been invested. Franco was given enhanced pharmaceutical management. His wolf's milk cocktail was reformulated with sedatives balanced against stimulants. He was restricted to shorter trial sessions, with mandatory rest periods between hunts. And monitoring protocols were implemented to give control room staff better ability to intervene if his behavior became unsafe. These measures helped. Franco's subsequent trials showed better control. The killing rate decreased to acceptable levels. The docks remained operational, but the incident had revealed something everyone preferred to ignore. The entire program rested on the controlled use of people who were fundamentally uncontrollable. Prime assets were effective because they were genuinely dangerous. but genuine danger couldn't be completely managed. Eventually, something would go wrong. Someone would break protocol. The predators would turn on their handlers. This was the logical endpoint of weaponizing human pathology. You could direct it, channel it, deploy it strategically, but you couldn't eliminate the fundamental chaos that made these people weapons in the first place. Easterman knew this. His private notes from late March reveal someone aware the program was approaching unsustainable territory. But his response wasn't to pull back. It was to push harder, to process as many reagents as possible before circumstances forced cessation, to prove the concept worked even if individual implementations were messy. He was building a legacy on suffering, and he needed that legacy to be significant enough to justify everything he'd done. The approval he'd never received from his mother, the recognition he'd craved his entire life, would come from creating a program so valuable to national security that history would remember him as visionary rather than torturer. This need for validation drove everything that followed. The expansion of Season 1, the preparation for Season 2, the increasing desperation as external pressure mounted and internal problems accumulated, and somewhere in the facility's depths, Franco Barbie continued preparing for the next trial, loading Lupara, drinking wolf's milk, listening to recordings that told him his father was proud, drawing wolves on the walls of his holding area, still believing he was earning something that would never come, still hunting people who'd never volunteered for any of this, still being exactly what his damage had made him, weaponized by an institution that saw his pathology and decided it was useful rather than requiring treatment. The machinery kept grinding, the bodies kept accumulating, and Season 1 moved toward conclusions that everyone involved would spend years trying to hide. Chapter 7. The Evolution Nobody Talks About. By mid-1960, Project Lupara had processed large numbers of reagents through the dock environment, and the data revealed something that would reshape how Murkoff understood psychological conditioning. The reagents who survived Franco weren't just fearful. They were different in ways that exceeded original predictions. Traditional PTSD from combat or trauma created hypervigilance and avoidance behaviors. People became cautious, risk-averse, focused on preventing re-exposure to traumatic stimuli. Reagents who'd been hunted by Franco developed something else entirely. They became aggressive, proactive. Instead of avoiding danger, they moved toward it with calculated precision. Their threat assessment was immediate and accurate. Their decision-making under pressure was faster than personnel with years of military training. And most significantly, their capacity for violence had been fundamentally rewired. Easterman called this phenomenon predator inoculation. By exposing regents to sustained threat from someone genuinely trying to kill them, the facility wasn't just teaching fear management. It was transforming prey psychology into predator psychology. Reagents learned to think like Franco thought, constantly assessing environments for tactical advantages, viewing other people as potential threats or assets, operating with the assumption that violence was always an available option. This transformation was exactly what military applications required. Soldiers needed to be predators, not prey. They needed to move through hostile territory with confidence rather than hesitation. They needed to make kill decisions instantly, without moral deliberation slowing response time. The docks were producing this transformation more effectively than any previous trial environment, and the reason was Franco himself. Coyle was frightening but ultimately human in his violence. Gooseberry was unpredictable, but her threats followed patterns tied to her delusions. Franco was something more primal, a genuinely broken predator whose behavior couldn't be fully predicted because his own mind was too fractured to follow consistent logic. Surviving him required developing similar psychology. You couldn't outthink Franco because he wasn't thinking rationally. You had to operate on instinct, accept that death could come from any angle at any moment. and move through that acceptance rather than being paralyzed by it. This created reagents who were extraordinarily valuable for certain operations, deep cover assignments where personnel might face unexpected threats, paramilitary operations where rules of engagement were deliberately vague, interrogation work where the interrogator needed to be comfortable with extreme violence. Murkoff began receiving requests from military and intelligence contacts for reagents who'd specifically completed the dock trials. These requests came with premium pricing. The company realized they'd stumbled into a niche market, producing personnel psychologically prepared for operations that regular soldiers couldn't stomach. The financial implications transformed Project Lupara from experimental program into profit center. Easterman received increased funding and authority to expand operations. Additional prime assets were recruited to supplement Franco's work. The dock environment was replicated at a second location, allowing parallel processing of more reagents. But here's what nobody talks about when discussing Season 1's success: the transformation Easterman celebrated as predator inoculation was actually systematic destruction of human empathy and moral reasoning. These reagents hadn't become better soldiers, they'd become sociopaths, people whose capacity for normal human connection had been burned away through sustained trauma, until what remained was efficient but fundamentally broken. The psychological assessments confirmed this. Reagents' post-doc processing showed dramatically reduced empathy scores, flattened emotional affect, and decision-making patterns that prioritized efficiency over ethical consideration. They weren't experiencing PTSD symptoms like flashbacks or avoidance because they'd moved beyond traumatic response into something more disturbing. They'd integrated the trauma so completely that violence became their baseline rather than an exception requiring processing. In the kind of assessment Murkoff would value most, a post-doc reagent gets shown footage of civilian casualties from conflict zones while staff measure physiological responses, heart rate, skin conductivity, facial tension, and sometimes the horror isn't a spike in stress. It's the absence of one, no flinch, no visible distress, not because the violence is tolerable, but because the capacity to be disturbed has been sanded down into something blank. In Murkoff language, that kind of subject isn't broken. He's optimally prepared for operations requiring moral flexibility. This clinical language masked the reality. They'd created someone who could commit atrocities without psychological consequence because his psychology had been surgically removed and replaced with something that only resembled human consciousness. This was the true legacy of Season 1, not the advancement of interrogation techniques or the development of better training protocols, but the proof that you could take ordinary people and transform them into functional sociopaths through systematic psychological destruction. And that transformation was marketable, valuable, desired by organizations that needed personnel willing to do things that human beings with intact empathy would refuse. Murkoff wasn't just torturing people. They were discovering that torture could be industrialized, scaled, turned into a service that governments and corporations would pay premium rates to access. Chapter 8: Franco's Deterioration. While Project Lupara thrived financially, Franco continued his slow collapse. The pharmaceutical management helped control his most extreme behaviors, but it couldn't address the fundamental issue. Franco's mind was fragmenting further with each trial. The violence he committed daily, combined with his pre-existing psychological damage and the stimulants he consumed, was creating cumulative neurological harm. Staff began documenting concerning symptoms. Franco experienced visual hallucinations between trials, seeing wolves that weren't present, speaking to family members who weren't there. His already childlike affect became more pronounced. He'd throw tantrums when told to return to his holding area, would cry inconsolably if his Lupara required maintenance that temporarily separated him from the weapon. His fixation on the wolf mythology intensified to delusional levels. He began insisting that he was literally descended from wolves, that his mother had been a wolf who'd abandoned him, that shooting reagents was how he proved his worth to the pack. These weren't metaphors for Franco. They were genuine beliefs about his origin and nature. Facility psychiatrists warned that Franco was experiencing early-stage psychotic disorder, possibly schizophrenia triggered by sustained drug use and psychological stress. They recommended evaluation for antipsychotic medication, potentially reducing his active trial participation. Easterman rejected the recommendation. Franco was still functional. The hallucinations and delusions didn't prevent him from hunting reagents effectively. Introducing antipsychotics might stabilize his mental state, but could also reduce the enthusiastic violence that made him so effective as prime asset. This decision prioritized operational effectiveness over human welfare, even the welfare of someone Murkoff employed. Franco was treated as equipment that would eventually wear out, and the goal was to extract maximum use before that deterioration required replacement. The recordings that sustained Franco's compliance became more elaborate. The voice actor mimicking Salvatore Barbi received detailed scripts emphasizing how proud the family was, how Franco had proven himself, how he was becoming the son his father had always wanted. These messages were calculated to keep Franco functional for a few more months, maybe a year, before his inevitable psychological collapse made him unusable. Franco believed every word. Between trials, he'd listen to the recordings repeatedly, clinging to the validation they provided. He'd talk about going home to New Orleans, about being welcomed back into the family, about finally earning the acceptance he'd craved since childhood. Staff who overheard these monologues found them disturbing. Everyone knew the truth. Salvatore Barbi hadn't contacted Murkoff about Franco. The Barbi family had no idea where Franco was, and wouldn't have cared if they'd known. Franco was never going home. He was being used until he broke completely. Then he'd be disposed of like the reagents he hunted. But nobody told him. The lies were necessary for operational continuity, and Franco's capacity to recognize lies had been compromised by the damage he'd sustained since birth. The abuse that had shaped him, and the drugs that kept him functional enough to serve Murkoff's purposes. His physical health was also declining. The Lapara's recoil continued damaging his already fragile facial structure. His bones were breaking and healing incorrectly, creating additional deformities that worsened his appearance. He experienced chronic pain that he self-medicated with increasing amounts of wolf's milk, creating addiction that further destabilized his mental state. By late 1960, Franco Barbi was simultaneously Murkoff's most valuable prime asset and a catastrophe waiting to happen. The incident in March had proven he could snap without warning. Enhanced monitoring and pharmaceutical management reduced the risk, but couldn't eliminate it. Murkoff began developing contingency plans. If Franco became unusable, the dock environment would transition to a different prime asset, possibly someone with sniper training who could provide range threat without Franco's instability. If Franco became dangerous to facility staff, he'd be terminated and disposed of like any other security risk. These plans were never shared with Franco. He continued believing he was valuable, that he was earning his way back to family acceptance, that everything he did at Signala mattered beyond the immediate violence. And in a tragic sense, he was right. He did matter. He mattered as proof that the most damaged people could be weaponized if you found the right combination of manipulation and opportunity. He mattered as demonstration that range prime assets were viable for psychological conditioning. He mattered as the instrument that transformed hundreds of Reagents from ordinary people into efficient sociopaths. He just didn't matter in the way he desperately needed to matter, as a son worthy of his father's love. That would never happen. His father had sent him away because his existence was embarrassment. Murkoff used him because his pathology was profitable, and when his usefulness ended, he'd be erased as thoroughly as the reagents whose deaths he'd caused. This was the machine's logic. People were components. Components that broke were replaced. Sentiment was inefficiency, and Signala was nothing if not efficient. Chapter 9. The Question Nobody Asks. We're past the halfway point now, and if you're still here, the next section is where everything we've covered starts connecting to the broader Outlast universe in ways that most people miss. Because here's the question nobody asks about Season 1. Why did Murkoff develop Franco into a prime asset when they already had Coil and Gooseberry? What specific problem was Project Lupara solving that the existing facility couldn't handle? The answer reveals Murkoff's long-term strategy, and it's more disturbing than the immediate horror of the trials themselves. The Signala facility was never treated as a simple, one-off installation in the lore. It was framed as a prototype proving ground for Project Lathe's mind control ambitions. The facility was expensive, required constant security to prevent discovery, and existed in a legal gray area that classified program status could only protect for so long. Murkoff's leadership understood from the beginning that eventually the program would face shutdown from political pressure or security breach. The goal was never to run Signala indefinitely. The goal was to perfect conditioning techniques that could be applied elsewhere by other organizations in contexts where Murkoff could profit from licensing their methodology without bearing the operational risks. Think about it strategically. If you're Murkoff and you've discovered how to reliably transform ordinary people into programmable weapons, the smart business move isn't to operate one facility processing a few hundred subjects yearly. The smart move is to package your techniques as a service that governments and corporations can purchase and implement themselves. But that requires standardization. Coil and Gooseberry were effective prime assets, but they were also unique individuals whose specific pathologies couldn't be easily replicated. You couldn't create more coils or gooseberries on demand. Their effectiveness came from their particular brands of damage, and damage of that specificity was rare. Franco solved this problem. His effectiveness came primarily from his weapon, not his personality. Yes, his instability and childlike affect added psychological pressure, but the core of his value was simpler. He had a gun and he used it enthusiastically. That was replicable. You could find other damaged people with firearms and minimal moral constraints. You could train them to patrol environments and shoot at designated targets. You could create Franco-style prime assets at scale in ways you couldn't create more coils. Project Lupara was proof of concept for scalable threat design. Show that ranged weapons changed conditioning effectiveness. Document the specific psychological transformations that resulted. Create protocols that could be implemented at other facilities by other personnel, with different prime assets filling the same functional role. This is why Season 1 was so thoroughly documented. Every trial was recorded, every reagent's progression was tracked, every pharmaceutical intervention was logged. Murkoff wasn't just running experiments. They were creating an instruction manual that could be sold to the highest bidder. And those bidders existed. By the late 1950s and early 1960s, Cold War tensions had multiple intelligence services flirting with mind control and behavioral experimentation, from CIA-linked MK Ultra collaborations to parallel programs hinted at in declassified material and commentary. Murkoff's pitch was elegant. We've already done the messy experimental phase. We've documented what works. We can provide consultation, training, even personnel to help you implement similar programs. You get the benefits without having to develop the techniques yourself or risk the early failures we've already absorbed. This was the true horror of Season 1, the immediate suffering of reagents being processed through the dock trials was terrible. But the long-term implication, that Murkoff was preparing to export these techniques globally, enabling dozens or hundreds of facilities in multiple countries to replicate Signala's atrocities, was catastrophic. Franco was never meant to stay at Signala forever. He was a prototype, prove that his style of prime asset worked, document the results, and then develop methods to create similar threats anywhere. The data from Project Lupara would eventually inform facilities across the world. Different countries, different prime assets, different reagents, but all using the same core methodology that Franco's docs had proven effective. Range threat creating sustained pressure, pharmaceutical enhancement reducing resistance, environmental design eliminating safety, moral compromise forced through impossible choices. Multiply that template across dozens of facilities, processing thousands of subjects, and you get an infrastructure for producing sociopathic operatives at industrial scale. This was Murkoff's vision, not a single program but a global network of psychological conditioning facilities, all generating revenue for the company, while producing personnel willing to commit any atrocity their handlers required. Season 1 succeeded. The techniques worked. The documentation was comprehensive. By late 1960, Murkoff was preparing sales presentations for potential clients, demonstrating return on investment calculations, emphasizing how much cheaper it was to reprogram existing personnel than to recruit people who were already morally flexible. And Franco kept hunting, unaware that his value wasn't personal but methodological. He thought he mattered as an individual. He thought Salvatore would be proud of him specifically. But to Murkoff, he mattered only as proof that weapons plus pathology equaled effective conditioning tools, and that formula could be replicated anywhere with different weapons and different pathologies producing similar results. He was being used to build a system that would outlive him, that would continue destroying people long after his inevitable breakdown made him disposable. His suffering, his damage, his desperate need for approval, all of it was fuel for machinery that transformed human beings into weapons, then sold the transformation process to anyone willing to pay. Chapter 10. The Network That Survived. But some reagents escaped. Not many. Not enough to expose the program, but enough to create problems that Murkoff spent decades trying to contain. These survivors didn't go public immediately. They couldn't. The non-disclosure agreements they'd signed under coercion carried severe penalties. The monitoring systems Murkoff embedded during their processing meant the company could track their locations and communications. And most critically, they'd been so thoroughly gaslit during their time at Signala that they didn't trust their own memories. Was the facility real? Had they actually been tortured? Or were the fragmentary recollections just psychotic breaks from whatever pharmaceutical contamination they'd been exposed to? The survivors found each other gradually, cautiously, through the coded language of people who'd experienced trauma that couldn't be spoken about directly. They gravitated toward veteran support groups, not because they'd served in the military, but because the vocabulary of combat trauma was the closest approximation to what they'd endured. PTSD, hypervigilance, trust issues, gaps in memory, nightmares about environments that might not have existed. These were the words that made sense, and occasionally someone in those groups would mention specific details that only Signala survivors would know. The static from Easterman's broadcasts, the smell of the pharmaceutical cocktails, the sound of Coyle's chains or gooseberries singing or Franco's Lupara firing in enclosed spaces. Recognition was dangerous but necessary. The alternative, believing you were insane, that the scars on your skull from night vision goggles were self-inflicted, that the memories of trials were elaborate delusions, was psychologically unbearable. Finding another survivor meant confirming reality, validating that what you remembered had actually happened. These connections built slowly into a network that Murkoff's security apparatus detected but couldn't fully shut down. The survivors were too dispersed, too careful, too committed to not being silenced. They shared information through dead drops and encrypted communications. They documented their experiences in journals that were copied and distributed so that if individual survivors disappeared, their testimony would persist. And they began tracking others. Murkoff had processed hundreds of Reagents through Season 1 alone, with more through subsequent iterations of the program. Most had been successfully programmed and deployed, functioning as sleeper agents embedded in civilian populations, but some had resisted programming, been released as failures, or simply fallen through the cracks during the chaos of facility operations. The network started identifying these survivors, warning them that they might be monitored, offering support for dealing with the psychological aftermath, building a community of witnesses who could corroborate each other's accounts if the opportunity to expose the program ever emerged. They also tracked the prime assets. Coil's ultimate fate remains unclear in the record survivors could access. Gooseberry's fate remains unclear, though some documents suggest she was transferred to other facilities. The beast was mentioned in fragmentary records but never conclusively identified, and Franco. Multiple survivors reported encounters with him during doc trials. They described his appearance, his behavior, his lupara, his wolf obsession. They confirmed that he was real, that his violence was genuinely uncontrolled, that he'd killed Reagents not just for conditioning purposes, but because something in him enjoyed the hunt. Some survivors expressed sympathy for Franco despite everything he'd done to them. They recognized that he was also a victim, someone so damaged by genetics and abuse that Murkoff had found him easy to weaponize. They understood that he'd been lied to just as they had. Promised approval that would never come. Used until his inevitable breakdown made him disposable. Others felt only rage. Franco had killed people they'd known, had hunted them through the docks with enthusiastic violence, had been given power over them that he'd wielded without mercy. His own victimization didn't erase their trauma. His pathology didn't excuse his choices. This divide, whether prime assets deserved sympathy or condemnation, created tensions within the survivor network that were never fully resolved. But both perspectives agreed on the fundamental truth. Franco, Coil, Gooseberry, all the prime assets were instruments of a larger system. They were terrible in their individual actions, but they were enabled by institutional structures that found their pathologies useful and gave them permission to be monsters. The real monsters wore suits and called themselves behavioral scientists. They wrote memos calculating acceptable casualty rates. They authorized pharmaceutical experiments on unwilling subjects. They built facilities designed to destroy human consciousness and called it national security research. The Survivor Network's ultimate goal was to expose this system, to document its operations so thoroughly that Murkoff couldn't hide behind classified program status or corporate legal protections. But that goal remained elusive. Every attempt to interest journalists or investigators ran into obstacles. Evidence disappeared. Witnesses recanted. Media outlets that seemed ready to publish suddenly killed stories without explanation. Murkoff's influence was vast, and their commitment to secrecy was absolute. The company had resources to silence most threats and contingencies for eliminating threats that couldn't be silenced. The Survivor Network persisted primarily because Murkoff calculated that hunting down every former reagent would create more exposure risk than letting them exist in monitored obscurity. But the network documented everything. They gathered testimony, collected whatever physical evidence members had retained, cross-referenced their memories to build comprehensive accounts of facility operations. They prepared for the eventual moment when circumstances might shift enough that exposure became possible, and they waited, because that's what survivors do. They carry witness. They refuse to let atrocity be forgotten. They hold truth even when truth can't be spoken publicly. The wait continues. Murkoff's programs evolved beyond Signala, beyond the original trials, into operations that incorporated everything Season 1 proved effective. Mount Massive eventually fell apart in ways that exposed some of the corporation's activities. But Project Lupara, Franco's docks, the specific methodologies of Season 1, these remained largely hidden, known only to survivors and to the people who designed the suffering. Franco himself disappeared from records after 1961. Some documents suggest he became too unstable for continued use and was transferred elsewhere. Other sources indicate he died during a trial when his psychotic episode caused him to attack facility staff, forcing his termination. The truth remains unclear, obscured by Murkoff's obsessive information control. What's certain is that his legacy persisted. The techniques Project Lupara developed continued being refined. The proof that ranged prime assets enhanced conditioning effectiveness became standard doctrine in psychological warfare research. And somewhere in classified archives, comprehensive documentation exists, detailing exactly how to break human beings using sustained threat from armed predators who enjoy hunting. That documentation represents the survival of Season 1's evil. Franco is gone. The original dock facility is closed or repurposed. Most of the reagents who were processed there are dead or scattered. But the knowledge remains, waiting to be accessed by whoever has clearance and interest in replicating those results. Chapter 11. What Season 1 Taught Us. The deeper truth about Season 1 emerges when you examine what Murkoff learned versus what we should learn from the same events. Murkoff's takeaway was operational. They learned that psychological conditioning worked faster when physical threat was constant. They learned that prime assets with ranged weapons created different trauma responses than close-quarters threats. They learned that pharmaceutical enhancement accelerated breakdown but required careful calibration. They learned that some personality types resisted all programming, while others could be transformed remarkably quickly. These lessons became part of institutional knowledge that guided future programs. Season 2 would incorporate ranged threats as standard. Subsequent iterations would refine pharmaceutical protocols. The entire Outlast Trials experience, as documented in later seasons, shows the evolution of techniques that Season 1 pioneered. But the lesson we should take is completely different. Season 1 demonstrates how institutional evil becomes banal. Easterman didn't wake up planning to torture hundreds of people. He accumulated compromises, accepting funding from Murkoff, agreeing to work on classified programs, participating in experiments that gradually escalated, justifying each step as necessary for larger goals. By the time Project Lupara was processing reagents through Franco's dock, Easterman had traveled so far down the path of atrocity that returning seemed impossible. He'd invested his entire career and self-concept into these programs. Admitting they were evil would require admitting he was evil, and that admission was psychologically unbearable. Franco's story demonstrates how damage compounds across generations. His genetic condition created initial rejection. His family's abuse transformed rejection into pathology. His father's criminal enterprise gave him tools and permission for violence. Miami provided opportunity for his pathology to flourish unchecked. And Murkoff offered institutional framework that weaponized everything his damage had made him. At every stage, intervention could have prevented what followed. Medical support for his Pfeiffer syndrome, psychiatric help for childhood abuse, law enforcement response to his early murders. But each system failed or ignored him, and those cumulative failures created someone Murkoff found perfect for their purposes. The Reagents' experiences demonstrate how ordinary people can be systematically destroyed when institutions prioritize objectives over humanity. These weren't criminals or volunteers. They were teachers, postal workers, mechanics, people living normal lives who responded to advertisements or were caught by criminal justice systems that offered facility processing as alternative to incarceration. They were told they'd be serving their country. They were promised compensation and benefits. They were assured everything was legal and approved. And then they were tortured until their capacity for moral reasoning was destroyed, leaving shells that looked human but operated like machines. The ease with which this happened is the most frightening element. It didn't require supernatural evil or extraordinary circumstances. It required money, institutional authority, classified program status that prevented oversight, and enough people willing to participate in atrocity when that participation was framed as legitimate work. The staff who monitored trials and took notes weren't monsters. They were researchers and security personnel, and pharmaceutical technicians doing jobs they'd been hired for. The lawyers who drafted non-disclosure agreements weren't evil. They were providing legal services to a corporate client. The executives who approved funding weren't cackling villains. They were business professionals pursuing profitable opportunities in an emerging market. Evil at this scale is bureaucratic. It happens in memos and budget meetings and performance evaluations. It's distributed across enough people that no individual feels fully responsible, and it's justified through language that obscures reality. Subjects become reagents, torture becomes conditioning, murder becomes asset disposal. Systematic psychological destruction becomes advanced training protocols. Season 1 succeeded because everyone involved convinced themselves they were doing legitimate work, that the classified nature of the program meant oversight was happening at levels above their clearance, that surely someone with more authority had verified this was legal and necessary. But nobody had. Or if someone had, they'd done so through the same self-deception that allowed Easterman to believe he was advancing science rather than committing crimes against humanity. The Survivor Network's existence proves that resistance is possible even under totalitarian conditions. The reagents who maintained moral clarity despite pharmaceutical manipulation and psychological pressure, who communicated carefully to build solidarity, who escaped and refused to let their experiences be erased. They demonstrate that human consciousness can resist institutional programming when that consciousness is strong enough. But their struggle also demonstrates the cost of resistance. Most who resisted openly were converted to ex-pops, their minds destroyed permanently. Those who resisted subtly and survived carried trauma that shaped every subsequent moment of their lives. The network they built provided support but couldn't undo the damage. Recovery from Signala wasn't a destination, but an ongoing process of learning to live with psychological wounds that would never fully heal. Season 1's legacy extends far beyond Franco's docs or the specific reagents processed during 1959 and 60. The program proved concepts that would guide behavioral conditioning research for decades. The methodologies would be adapted and refined. The documentation would inform future facilities, and the fundamental insight that ordinary people could be transformed into weapons through systematic psychological destruction would shape intelligence and military operations worldwide. This is the horror that persists after Franco's laughter fades and the Lupara's echo stops reverberating through shipping containers. The knowledge remains, the techniques remain, and institutions that found those techniques valuable continue existing, continue looking for ways to produce personnel who will follow any order without moral resistance or psychological breakdown. If Signala ever truly shut down in the canon timeline, that closure is buried under redactions and rumor. What is clear is that its methods reverberate into later Murkoff operations, but the machinery they represented keeps grinding in other locations under different names, processing new subjects through refined versions of trials that Season 1 pioneered. And Somewhere in corporate offices and classified government facilities, people are reading documentation about Project Lupara, analyzing the data, considering how they might improve on Murkoff's work. They're not monsters. They're professionals doing their jobs, pursuing objectives they've been told are necessary, participating in systems too large and complex for any individual to fully resist. That's the machine's true power. It doesn't require exceptional evil. It just requires ordinary people willing to do terrible things when those things are authorized, compensated, and framed as legitimate work. Season 1 taught Murkoff how to break people more efficiently. It should teach us how frighteningly easy that breaking becomes when institutions prioritize power over humanity, when profit matters more than ethics, when classified program status prevents accountability. The question isn't whether this could happen. It did happen. The question is whether we're paying enough attention to prevent it from happening again under different names in different locations with different victims who will never be able to fully testify about what was done to them. That question doesn't have a comfortable answer, which means we're probably not asking it seriously enough. Epilogue. The Echo. The docks are empty now. The shipping containers sit rusting in whatever desert location Murkoff abandoned when Project Lupara concluded. The medicine that was poisoned reached people who never understood why they got sick. The reagents who survived scattered across the country, trying to rebuild lives from fragments of whoever they'd been before Signala carved out their capacity for normalcy. Franco is gone. Whether dead or simply erased from accessible records, he disappeared from history the way Murkoff preferred their inconvenient evidence to disappear. No grave, no memorial, no acknowledgement that a damaged man lived and was weaponized and eventually disposed of when his usefulness ended. His Lupara might sit in evidence storage somewhere, tagged with a number that doesn't connect to any public case. Or it might have been destroyed, eliminating physical artifacts that could corroborate survivor testimony. The facility can deny everything if the weapons don't exist, if the documentation stays classified, if enough time passes that witnesses die and memory fades into uncertainty. But the survivors remember. They carry Franco's laughter in their nightmares. They startle at sounds that resemble shotgun slides. They avoid open spaces where sight lines are long, where predators might watch from elevated positions, where running feels futile because threat can reach you from distances your mind knows are safe but your body refuses to believe. They remember Easterman's voice from the broadcasts, the false paternal concern, the reassurances that their suffering had purpose. They remember the sleep rooms, pharmaceutical haze, and the way time stopped meaning anything. They remember the moral choices that weren't really choices, the impossible situations where every option involved betrayal or violence or complicity in something their previous selves would have found unthinkable. And they remember the other reagents who didn't survive, the ones who broke completely, the ones who were converted to X-Pops, the ones who were killed during trials because they weren't fast enough or lucky enough or broken in ways that permitted continued functioning. Those dead don't have graves either. They're buried in deserts or cremated in facilities with cooperative management. Their families were told they walked away, or died in accidents, or simply vanished in ways that happen to people living on society's margins. The families might have suspected different truths, but suspicion without proof becomes just another weight to carry. Season 1 ended because programs eventually end. Funding shifts, priorities change, external pressure becomes unmanageable, or the techniques get refined enough that experimental facilities become unnecessary. The knowledge extracted from Franco's hunting and the reagent's suffering got archived, ready for future access by whoever had clearance and interest. The machinery moved on. Murkoff continued operating. New programs launched. The people who designed Season 1 received promotions or transferred to other divisions. Nobody faced prosecution because the programs had classified status and legal protections that insulated participants from accountability. This is how institutional evil persists. The specific manifestations end. Signala closes, Franco disappears, the docks get abandoned, but the structures that enabled them remain intact. The legal frameworks that allowed classified programs to operate without oversight. The corporate protections that shield decision makers from consequences. The cultural willingness to accept that national security justifies measures we'd condemn in any other context. Season 1's true horror isn't just what happened to specific reagents in a specific facility during 1959 and 60. It's the demonstration that systems exist which can transform human suffering into profit and advancement. And those systems face minimal resistance because they're authorized, classified, and distributed across enough participants that nobody feels individually responsible for outcomes that were collectively catastrophic. Franco Barbie was a broken man weaponized by people who saw profit in his pathology. The reagents were ordinary people destroyed by an institution that viewed their consciousness as raw material. Easterman was a damaged person seeking approval through atrocity, and Murkoff was a corporation pursuing market opportunities in the industrialization of psychological destruction. All of these truths coexist: the individual damage, the institutional evil, the systemic structures that enable both. Season 1 was simultaneously a story about specific people and a demonstration of how easily humanity becomes negotiable when institutions prioritize power over ethics. The survivors carry this understanding. They know that what happened to them could happen to anyone under similar circumstances, that ordinary people can be transformed into weapons, that damage compounds when systems fail to intervene, that institutional evil doesn't require exceptional malice, just ordinary people willing to participate in horror. When that participation is authorized and compensated, they carry witness, they document, they wait for circumstances that might allow exposure, and they live with the knowledge that they survived something designed to destroy them, that they maintained enough humanity to remember and resist, even when resistance seemed futile. That survival is defiance. Every day a former reagent chooses to keep living despite the trauma Signala carved into their consciousness is a rejection of Murkoff's premise that people are programmable machines. Every connection the survivor network maintains is proof that solidarity can persist even when institutions work to enforce isolation. Every piece of testimony preserved is evidence waiting for the moment when silence becomes unsustainable. Season 1 is over. The immediate violence has stopped, but the fight to ensure its lessons are learned rather than repeated continues in the lives of survivors who refuse to let their experiences be erased, who insist that what happened to them mattered, who carry the truth about Franco's docks and Easterman's broadcasts, and the machinery that transformed human beings into weapons while calling it science. The echo of Lupara fire still reverberates through their nightmares, but they're still here to hear it, still present to testify, still alive despite everything designed to destroy them. And that's something. In a story this dark, maybe that's everything.